Before we begin, a disclaimer. This video deals with heavy and/or adult topics like mental illness, sexuality, and trauma. If these topics are triggering for you, this might not be your video. Please proceed with caution and be nice in the comments. Vulnerability is hard, but I'd like to think my audience is awesome and welcoming towards it.
Hello, this is Gang. Welcome back to my channel. If you've already been here, if not, hello. It is wonderful to have you here. Make yourself comfortable. I hope you'll stay. Have a cup of tea. And by staying, I mean subscribe. Now you usually get crafty videos from me, like painting stuff or sewing things, or the occasional thrift haul, and I've got to make one of these again sometime soon because the treasures just keep piling up and I haven't done one in ages. But even if it doesn't seem like it, I sometimes also have a thought or two, and this time it actually felt worth sharing it. Kidding, my brain is constantly working. Maybe not coherently, but there is a constant stream of overthinking ideas, concepts and theories. Also, I'm an oversharer. I just don't have the spoons to make all of this ubiquitous mind blab into videos. Also, the world keeps telling me to niche in. Anyway, this is a video about LARP theory. Not researched or academic LARP theory, because I do not have the attention span for that, and it's also kind of a scary rabbit hole to go into, but rather things that keep crossing my mind as someone who's been in the hobby for a while. I feel like I need to preface this with the fact that I do German fantasy LARP. German LARP is vastly different from Nordic LARP or LARP in Scandinavia, which are actually two different things. LARP in England, LARP in Australia, and LARP in North America. Especially LARP in North America. And fantasy, of course, is different from other genres as well. Some LARP cultures in Central and Southern Europe are somewhat comparable to German LARP as far as I know, but I can't speak on that with authority. And I also don't do blockbusters. In fact, during the last few years, I've mostly been to big, almost festival-like events where it doesn't necessarily get very intimate, and extreme emotions are very much an opt-in experience. You have to seek them out. They are not necessarily brought to you. But at the same time, immersion is highly encouraged, and quality costume is something we pride ourselves on as a community. If you come from a Nordic blockbuster or American background, or you know, one of the others, your experience might actually differ from mine. This does not invalidate anyone's opinion or experiences. I might just be talking about things that your LARP culture does differently. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about and what this LARP is, I've got a video about that. I think it's over here. Anyway, I'll also link it down in the description. I might have to make a new one at some point because I have a lot of things to say about the topic, especially taking into account the aforementioned culture differences, but I digress. But enough with the preface, onto what I actually wanted to talk about. So when I first thought of Fetch Quest, I wanted to show you the entire creation of a character, from first concept to finish, but I think I actually started too late in the game, and too much of the character was already set to really take you along for the journey. Too many world building things were already decided, and I had basically too clear a picture of who they would be. Now, as of late, I'm developing another one. I just started, and I thought that this might actually be a better opportunity. Don't worry, Fetch Quest continues as planned, not as scheduled, because I don't have a schedule, and I still have a lot of things to go through, like character kit and world building wise, that I really want to share with you. I just want the opportunity to do more spitballing and experimenting, and to give you a glimpse on how the character creation process actually works and what thoughts go into it. Creating a LARP character that I want to commit to playing for more than one night is an intimate affair to me, and here's why. For me, characters serve two main purposes, aside from providing fun to myself and other players alike. An excuse to build and sew cool stuff, and a tool to explore sides of myself I don't necessarily have access to in my everyday life. The character and setting serves as a safety blanket of sorts, because the real world is scary and dangerous, but in this confine it's easier to let go and give into new things. Here are a few examples from my LARP career where this has happened. I've had a character with whom I dove deep into a lot of my issues and trauma. She was basically the embodiment of my feelings of otherness, of being an outcast for reasons that I cannot control. She wore a magical chain around her neck, always at the risk of being yanked around on it by the utterance of one single word, at the mercy of members of the community that she felt ostracized by. She had deeply ingrained survivor's guilt and trust issues, and while all of these things are dramatic escalations of the problem I faced at the time and that I'm still partially facing today, she helped me explore these things in an abstract way that I just could put away after I came home. In the end, I stopped playing her, not only because the group around her was slowly falling apart, but also because she stopped being good for my mental health and for me. I have another character that set out to be an exploration of my soft, feminine, nice girl side. Terribly nosy, but in the end a very lovely being. She ended up being manipulative, catty, selfish, and still very feminine. She is a boss, literally. She has employees. She's very cold-hearted, and she is a bitch. And a cold-hearted bitch. And I do enjoy playing her. She's not what I wanted, but in a way she is something that I need. While I am outspoken about a lot of things that bother me in real life, I hardly stand up for myself the way she would, because I try to be, kind of polite about it. She uses her femininity as a weapon, and she's treading close to a lot of horrible stereotypes, not about only high femme people, but also about people, and especially feminine people and women in business. I'll never be someone's boss, or at least not in that way. I don't want to boss people around, or I probably won't be that much of a bitch ever, but I also won't be that self-assured. And it sure is nice to test drive that persona, which surely encompasses some ugly traits I keep locked up, once a year. I even have a character who's basically me, just without the issues. I created that one as a breather after the first one I mentioned, the trauma scapegoat, and no, not even she gets off the hook. You know what, let's explore the falling apart of identity with that one. Take what you thought makes her who she is and just flush it down the storytelling toilet so we can see what happens with a tabula rasa of existential crisis, but in a low fantasy setting and within only 1 week and in a tent instead of, on my sofa during the whole pandemonium and generally. And that's what the world gets for therapy waiting lists being so long. But what's left? Plenty, because we all contain multitudes, but this character I feel like I really need after emerging from that strange cocoon that is the panini. The baseline idea for this character is a bit older, 4 or 5 years, and dates back to when I knew I had to either find or found a new group as my old one was dissolving. See the aforementioned, twice, trauma scapegoat. And of course I went for the latter, because I'm extra like that. I will freely admit that I'm not only a world-building junkie, but also very opinionated on the matter of aesthetic visions. Things have to make sense. Everything has to make sense. If I don't know the name of the pet turtle of the king's sister-in-law's cousin twice removed, what am I even doing here? I'll have you know that this is not as much of an exaggeration as you might think it is. So I had 2 options. One heavily historically inspired background, think along the visual standards of the of Witcher 3, or the Witcher games in general, but Witcher 3 is just the pinnacle. That also drew inspiration from one of the Redwall books, kind of comforting but also with a bit of a twist, and one more mythologically inspired with a costume threshold that most people possibly wouldn't be willing to adhere to or even start with. I wanted a group I didn't want to play alone. And the first one became my current group background, Meriastron, that is still being built and expanded and that I won't go into detail about right now because I could talk about it for 1 week straight. You know what, leave a comment if you do like the prospect of me talking about this for 1 week straight, because I will definitely do it if only one person thinks it's interesting, because I love talking about my stupid stuff. And the second is what is important for this character, and by means of that, this video. You might know that I'm a huge fan of the World of Darkness game, or sub-game, Changeling the Dreaming. I've always been fascinated by mythology and folklore, and the idea of being Fae in the modern world was something that deeply resonated with me. See, otherness, not belonging, constant identity crisis, the works. And that's another thing I won't dive into right now, because again, we'd be here for days. Because I just have so many feelings about this game. What I wanted to say is that while I had never wasted a lot of thoughts on them before, Changeling brought me closer to the idea and concept of satyrs. I grew to admire their hedonistic, feral physicality, and long story short, the intense costuming requirements group that I was dreaming up a few years back was a satyr tragos. Tragos is the collective term here, like a herd or a pack.
The word tragos comes from the Greek word for goat and from the term trachoidia, goat song, a form of Greek choric ceremony associated with satyr plays and the name given to the death dance of a satyr. Wait, are we saying it's a goat of satyrs?
Oh, perfectly poetic. This is incidentally one of the possible origins for the word tragedy. So a few months ago, I mentioned this story of how the whole thing came to be to one of my fellow Mariastroni, that this had been the alternative back then, and he said, yeah, he would have totally been down for that. We didn't know each other back when the group first came into play. Literally. So no huge wave of regret ensued, and also I do love my background and group. See, talking about it for 1 week straight. Recently, in the throes of pandemonium-induced annoyance of not being out there and partying my several body parts off, and desperately wanting exactly the escalation and revelry that I associate with satyrs, I mentioned it to him again, and he shrugged and went like, I might have already looked at stuff and compared prices. And by stuff he meant horns and legs and hooves and all those wonderful things, and now here we are. Finally. I'm building a satyr. There are a lot of mythological and world-building things I'd love to address, but that's something for another video, maybe someday. I do know better than to promise you anything though. Instead, in the spirit of what I've rambled about so far in this video, let me tell you what I want from the character as a tool for self-exploration. I want to play a thirst trap. I want to play a thirst trap. I want to play a thirst trap. I've never played a thirst trap before, in like 17 years of LARPing. I've never played a character who's conceptualized as sexy or has a lot of overt sensuous energy. My Mariastron character was supposed to tap into this more than all the characters I played before, but ended up being a team mom, and that's something I will be desperately trying to shake off after the pandemic. The only thing that comes close is a very fun harlot NPC I once played for like one evening, and I decided for her to be the village harlot. Nobody made me play this character. I am bad at tapping into my feminine wiles and my feminine side of sexy in real life, and it bothers me. Hell, I made an entire video about how my femininity feels somehow wrong. Sometimes I'm also bad at tapping into my masculine side of sexy or feeling sensuous in general, but that's not half as complicated as my relationship to the feminine bit. And I've found out in the last years that I feel more free in the expression of my sensuality at LARP than I do in real life. Again, it's a safety blanket, and I don't have to be myself with all the baggage that comes with that. But I never really explored it consciously. Most of why I don't have access to that side, however much I want it, is easy to trace back to personal trauma, slutshaming, and the patriarchy. Me and my sexy don't necessarily live on the same street all of the time for various unpleasant reasons that I will discuss in the following part. If you're not into listening to that, that is absolutely perfectly understandable, and here's a timestamp somewhere for you, and you can join us again later. Okay, let's get it over with. I've been diagnosed with PTSD for a few years now. I've been to therapy for it, but it still affects a lot of things because therapy never fixes, it only helps, and that is okay. I have the skills to deal with shit now. While part of the PTSD stems from emotional blackmail and gaslighting and a lot of other fun stuff, not fun at all, part of it is also sexual. I don't enjoy talking about it, but in the end this is about self-exploration and, in a way, self-therapy. And this trauma prominently feeds into my disconnect from the sensuous self, so I feel like I should address it. Also, more vulnerability and more openness about things like this probably doesn't hurt. We need to de-taboo the whole topic, even if it's uncomfortable. So my first encounters with sexuality that included other people were very much connected to coercion, or at the very least insistent persuasion. I was not in love with the person I first ever had sex with. I didn't even find him particularly attractive. He wouldn't leave me alone about the topic, and my teenage body was like, okay, you know what, we need to get this over with. Here are hormones. So I agreed, eventually. I can't remember if I ever initiated sex afterward either. It gets worse after that, and that shit show of a relationship continued for 3 more years, but I won't bore you with too many details. Again, I am an oversharer. All you need to know is that I was still a minor when this started, and he very much wasn't. All you need to know is that I was told I should be glad that somebody took me, and that after we finally broke up for good, he complained to a mutual friend that everything would be okay if he could still have sex with me and use my body regardless of my emotions for him. And towards him. All you need to know is that he was an abusive asshole I wish nothing but the worst upon, like erectile dysfunction and syphilis, and I mean syphilis with Renaissance medical treatment. So that wasn't a great start. In the following years I had several ill-fated things more. Once actually being shamed for having a sex drive at all, which hit really hard because that time I was in love. It was always either too much or too little or not the right thing, and I never really arrived at a point where my own view of my sexuality was mine alone, until about a year ago or so. I was really bad at communicating my needs, and I'm still working on it. So much for the trauma part. Welcome back to the people who skipped that tragedy. On to the slut-shaming! I don't get slut-shamed often, at least not to my face. My former best friend, a guy who kept thoughting it up, more power to you, do what you want, with every hot or perceivedly hot bloke he saw and he could get, once told me that I needed to stop being so slutty because his other female friends were talking. Suffice to say that I didn't give a fuck about these specific people, as this wasn't my friend group at all, but it was still weird. And my mum once said I looked skanky when I wore a tank top that actually showcased more cleavage than a crew neck. It was a sports tank top, it was a climbing top. By now I know that this probably stems from the fact that my mum is being slut-shamed even now if she wears something with a perceivable neckline just because she happens to have a big chest. No, Karen, she's not out to steal your man just because she has a rack. Fuck you, Karen. Don't mess with my mum. I had to explain to her that this was actually anti-feminist as fuck. I've actually seen more slut-shaming from women and feminine people than from men or masculines, and I can't even claim that I never did that either. The perception of a sexually active feminine person seems to be threatening on a psychological level rather than on a physical level, as it happens to be with masculine people. Maybe it's a stupid competition narrative, but it is there. Which brings me to my next point. I usually feel perfectly confident in my more masculine hotness. I'm absolutely here to steal your girlfriend, any day of the week. But masculine sexiness is one with an agency, or at least that's what the world tells us. And when a feminine character or person takes agency or even just hold of their sexuality and pleasure, it is almost always certain that they are a villain or at least a bitch, an undesirable character. Best recent example is Shadow and Bone, where the only two female characters that show interest in sex without a defined emotional bond are a depraved, child abuse endorsing brothel owner and the bitch that makes the main character's life unnecessarily hard. Way to go, folks, I thought this was written by a woman. That's not very feminist. Feminine sexuality without an emotional bond is almost always treated as something depraved. If a character has no single target sexuality, it's bad. They are a slut. They are just using people. How dare they lie their body and a feeling of arousal without tying it to one significant other? And even if everybody is into a heroine, she usually has one decided love interest, maximum two, where it's usually obvious which one will win in the end, and even then she probably won't get physical with at least one of them, because that would be bad and slutty. I could rant about true love, babies ever after one and only narratives now, but I think I had a topic for this video, and that wasn't it. Last up, the patriarchy. We all know what we do with the patriarchy. I don't want to be held back by these things. I don't want my trauma to have this much power over how I view myself and my body. I don't want the fear of being ostracized from the feminine collective for being sensuous and sexually active with more than one target, and I usually don't go to LARPs with my partner because of the disconnect we both want from real life, to hold me back, and the patriarchy sure as hell has no fucking right to dictate or even judge what I do. So that's one side I want to explore about myself, and what better than a satyr, a being of sensuous abandon and revelry. There's also another layer to this. Mythologically speaking, satyrs are a male-only and very heterosexualized species. Me, as a queer feminine person taking up space in that narrative, is a twist to the story, a taking up of space traditionally reserved for things that I am definitely not. Oh wow, that's deep. Neat. Didn't see that coming when I wrote this. The other thing that I want to explore is my own relationship to my needs, not only sexually, mind you, but also predominantly emotionally, because I'm not good at accessing those sometimes. Especially at LARP, when I'm there with a bunch of people that in some capacity I feel responsible for, I tend to shove back my own needs in favor for everyone else, which is not only bad for my well-being, but also for my enjoyment, and I don't even think the others benefit from it so much. I think I need to get closer to even figuring out what my needs are, and there's probably none better than a character based on goats, because goats don't take no shit, and they are very vocal and assertive about what they need and want. I volunteered at a deer park with a goat enclosure when I was a teenager, and I know what I'm talking about. I freaking love goats. I also want to get to know my jealousy and envy better. I don't deal well with those emotions because I have a fuck ton of internalized shame about them. Envious. Work harder to get what you want. Envy is weak.
Work harder to get what you want. Envy is weak. If you're not willing to work that hard, envy isn't allowed.
Or you don't
have the spoons, or it's something you can't control. No envy for you. You know your limits. You just shouldn't be a spoonie then. Or, just be happy with what you've got.
Just be happy with what you've got. Jealous?
Jealous.
Well, sucks to be you
then.
You're
undesirable.
You don't get to be jealous, especially
if you don't want to be exclusive yourself in whatever interpersonal relationship.
You can't claim a person.
Anyway, claiming people is a patriarchal, non-feminist concept, and therefore you have no right to be jealous. It's just not woke.
It's just not woke. Just a short disclaimer, this is all bullcrap. Feelings are okay, feelings need to be felt, and there's no use in shaming yourself for them. The thing that matters is the way you go about expressing them and what you do with them. So where does all this introspection leave me? To connect with my overall thirst trappiness, I need a teacher. I can't do that on my own. So I'm writing one. With a character lacking my baggage and sociocultural background, they're perfect for the job. And it also begs more questions. I'll have to figure out how a culture that doesn't vilify non-committal sensuality and sexuality and negative emotions works out without becoming ElfQuest wolf riders. No shade. Okay, maybe some. There still must be biases, because everybody has them. If somebody claims not to have biases, I don't believe them. And how do I work jealousy and selfishness into a character play without hurting others out of game? How do I get out of my own skin far enough to embrace what this character is supposed to teach me? And are there methods to ease into that? And that is, of course, just the part of the iceberg that's underwater. What about the tip? How do I do the thirst trappiness in terms of attire? How do I go about this on days I don't feel confident about my mortal coil? Is there a way to just costume myself into this mindset? What would help me with that? This whole project hasn't got a name yet, but I hope this is not the last thing you'll ever hear about it. If it happens to be thus, at least this video is a good insight into part of my character creation process. Not all of my characters are this deep. Sometimes I just want an excuse to build a certain thing or sew a certain garment. But this is surely part of the magic that is character and world building. And maybe my vulnerability in this regard has inspired one or two of you for their next endeavors in that regard. Here's to being selfish, jealous, full of envy, and maybe a thirst trap, but still not being a villain. It's okay to be these things, and I need to learn that. We probably all do. And with this, I leave you for now. Have a lovely time until we meet again.